thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you to the MIC for allowing me to do this presentation. Like she was saying, I'm a geologist. I am super passionate about this stuff. Whenever I can get a room of even like 2 people to listen to me talk about this for even 5 minutes, I'm excited. So this is wonderful. With all of that said, the lecture today is going to be about 45-ish minutes, and if at any time you need to like get up, go use the restroom, anything like that, or you need to go, you're not going to hurt my feelings. Just try to do it quietly, not disturb anyone around you. But yeah, I'm a geologist, and I work up at Canyonlands National Park, and so obviously today the lecture is going to be over the geology of Canyonlands. So can I get a show of hands real quick? How many of y'all are comfortable with geology? Whether you're a geologist or, you collect rocks, whatever it might be, fantastic, wonderful. And how many of y'all are locals, if you don't mind me asking? Okay, wonderful, awesome. It's always great to see y'all coming out. Yeah, so let's get into it. So just a quick brief history of Canyonlands National Park. Canyonlands has been home to people for over 10,000 years. People have been living, working, whatever it might be, inhabiting Canyonlands for a very, very long time, with our first European explorers coming out in 1859. And then finally having that expedition in 1869 with John Wesley Powell, and then becoming a national park in 1964. And obviously throughout that all, geology has had a very, very big role in how we view this area. Everything from whether it be agriculture to mining to now just recreation and day-to-day usage. But what I always like to talk about before I start these lectures is I find a lot of the time we all kind of have a rough idea on geology, but unless we really understand it, we don't always know how geology works necessarily on its fundamental level. And you have to have those fundamental ideas in place to understand actually what is happening out here. It really helps piece together all the rest of the ideas that I will be talking about in this lecture. So I'm going to be talking about what is geology. Geology is the science that deals with the Earth's physical structure and substance, its history, and the processes that act on it. So this can be anywhere from, I forgot I actually got a little laser here, historical geology, the study of what the Earth used to look like, dating back 4.56 billion years ago. Economic geology, that's one that we see a lot today. Again, I was talking about how I'm from Texas. Oil, petroleum, natural gas, all of this falls into the realm of economic geology. Petrology, study of rocks, mineralogy, studying minerals, geomorphology, seismology, volcanology, all these other realms of geology fall in this. So geology actually expands a lot bigger than just going and talking about rocks in southeastern Utah. It can happen anywhere in the world. I want to bring up these laws of geology, and these are kind of the 3 basic ones that will really help you understand what is going on out here, and that's uniformitarianism, original horizontality, and superposition. I'm going to break down each one of these here, starting with uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism, while it is a very big fancy word, the main idea of this is the present is the key to the past. And this idea is that Earth's processes and everything that goes along with that have been going on since the dawn of time. Even when the Earth wasn't here, physics has always acted how it does today. It would be very hard to understand how water flowed through Canyonlands if water flowed up, 200 million years ago, and then it just decided that, hey, I'm going to flip this around a little bit. So we have to understand this to understand what's going on now, because we don't know what happened then. We're basing everything we know about the past about what we know right now. The other one is original horizontality. This is the idea that when I talk about depositional layers, and I'll be talking about that quite a bit today because that is how we get our rock layers in Canyonlands and this entire area out here. And this is the idea that these sediments, as they are being deposited under the influence of gravity, almost always lay in these horizontal beds. So if we find something that looks kind of curved like this, we know that that probably happened after the layers were formed, and that can really help us understand what is actually going on out here and when this stuff happened. So if we see a curve like this happen in some of the rock layers, but maybe the rock layers above it don't have that, we know that those curves on the bottom happened before what's on top. And the last one, this might seem like the simplest, but sometimes it's one that we just completely forget about, and this is superposition. In general, unless something else has happened, the oldest rocks are going to be at the bottom with the youngest rocks on top. These layers are getting laid down. It goes back to what I was just talking about with original horizontality. It goes layer, 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 all the way up. So when we're talking about the oldest rocks, we're going to be talking about the ones at the bottom and then moving our way up. Now, all of these are subject to change. I know I just kind of talked about them as the basic laws. And there's a couple other ones there, but these are the big ones. But these are the ones we must understand to understand how Canyonlands is formed. And with that, there's also the three basic rock types. All of us probably know these. We learned them, when we were younger. If you don't remember them, here they are again. We have igneous rocks formed through cooling and solidification of magma or lava. So the LaSalle Mountains are a great example of that. Metamorphic rocks, these are when those rocks are changed physically or chemically through heat, pressure, and sometimes liquids can get in there and mess some stuff around. And then these are the big ones here, sedimentary rocks. These are the rocks we see all over the place. Canyonlands, as well as really Utah, is a staple for sedimentary rocks and how sedimentary rocks can be changed through different geologic processes. And then if I ever talk about lithification and I say, oh, these rocks have been lithified, I'm just meaning that's the process of whatever sediment was being laid down and turns it into rock. So let's talk about why you came here, the geology of Canyonlands. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the depositional environments, and just so you have an idea when I talk about these, there's a ton of different depositional environments that we see today, and just to kind of give you an idea what these would be, like tidal flats, we have deltas, beaches, we have desert lakes, glaciers, rivers, we have oceans, continental shelves, and these are environments where material has been left down. So if you're down at the beach, maybe some sand that's been blown down there and it's left down there, or maybe this river is carrying sediment from up here that it's broken down in the mountains and is carrying it and depositing it out here into the ocean. So that's how those rocks get there. We call those depositional environments. And here are the layers of Canyonlands as well as kind of the Moab area. If you're looking at this and you're like, oh, that's a lot of layers, I don't think I have time for this. This guy's about to bore me to death. We're just going to be talking about these right here. So everything from the Navajo Sandstone down to the Paradox Formation at our base. And then everything above that, that's when we start to get into like Arches National Park and the mountains, but y'all don't want to hear about that. And we'll start with the Paradox Formation. Paradox Formation is our base layer out here. As most of y'all know, especially if you're locals, we talk about the salt. We talk about this salt that's out here, this salt that is affected everything, and it's kind of a weird concept because when we talk about this, it isn't table salt. This isn't like salt that you see on your table at a restaurant. This is mineral salt, and these were laid down around 300 million years ago, like I was saying, from an ancient ocean. And these salts really consist of things like gypsum, anhydrites, and halite, which is like a table salt, but some other ones mixed in there, as well as a few other mineral salts. And it acts like the base for everything. So this is a piece of the Paradox Formation, just to show you. I know it's kind of dark in here, but just so y'all can see, it looks like a regular rock under normal circumstances. However, when it's put under a lot of pressure, it moves a lot more like a liquid. It doesn't act like a solid anymore. It's almost kind of like a tube of toothpaste. That's the analogy we use a lot of the time. With the Park Service, we talk about this tube of toothpaste that when it's sitting there, it really doesn't do anything. It just kind of sits in the tube, but when you apply pressure to it, it starts to move more like a liquid, and it will start to move how you want it to. I also sometimes describe it as us sitting on top of a waterbed. Everything underneath us is kind of subject to change. If we put pressure on one side, it'll affect another side, and things start to move around a lot more. This might look very complicated, don't worry. I'm not going to ask you to like break this down and talk about all the faults that are happening. But just to show you kind of what's happening, all these little layers here are starting to get morphed up and down, and that has to do with the salt and salt tectonics as the area around us changes. So you can see, like here, these lines that are moving in our stratus. I talked again at the very beginning about original horizontality. These layers were laid down flat, and then after the fact, we start to get all the super weird movement of rocks moving up and jetting up into layers above it and causing these weird anticlines and synclines and all sorts of other weird stuff. And this is kind of what's happening below us. Right above that is going to be the Cutler group, and this is a big group. Once you move kind of more into the Moab area, it's usually just referred to as the Cutler group undivided or undifferentiated. And when we get more into Canyonlands, especially Island in the Sky, we break it down into 4 different layers, which consist of the White Rim Sandstone, the Oregon Rock Shale, Cedar Mesa Sandstone, which are the Needles and Needles, and Uncompahgre Formation. So we're going to start. I'm going to skip over the Uncompahgre. It really don't see it too much, so I'm just going to skip over it for now and talk more about the Cedar Mesa Sandstone. So the Cedar Mesa Sandstone, like I was saying, are what make up the Needles of Needles. Some of y'all might have seen them already. If you're local to here, you might have seen them. If you're on vacation, go check these out. They're super, super cool, beautiful area, beautiful part of the park, and have great hiking. It's just really hot this time of the year. So take lots of water, please. So this sandstone is made up of near-shore sand dunes intermingling with periodic floods that brought darker red sediments from the Uncompahgre Mountains. So what you can see here are those darker reds along with kind of more of the near-shore sand dunes that make up that lighter color. So what's happening is kind of this crisscross where some comes in from here, and then maybe that's going on for a few thousand years, and then more comes in from the Uncompahgre, and so it leaves this layer. And what you end up with is this kind of candy cane look and this striped look to the needles that we get. Now that's just how the rocks got there. Now how do the actual needles get there? And that's due to jointing in the rocks. So when we talk about jointing in rocks, these are just like small cracks or fractures. I'm sorry, I have to walk around a lot when I'm talking. These are when little cracks in the rock form, and when those happen, water wants to go wash through there. Water is following just the flow of gravity. It's going through those. Weathering and erosion starts to cut into those joints and slowly cut away at the sides here, exposing these kind of inner layers of rocks. Very similar to if we see Bryce Canyon, a lot of the spires that we see out here, some of them can vary in exactly how they form, but this is kind of what we're seeing a lot of the time in terms of these spires, needles, hoodoos, whatever you want to call them. Above that is the Oregon Rock Shale. This is this really beautiful kind of darkish brown red layer that sits in the very deep parts of the Canyonlands. So if y'all have been to Canyonlands before and looked down way into the bottom of the canyons, and when I talk about this, I'm a little bit biased because I work at Ice Sky. So when you're at Ice Sky and you're looking down, you're seeing these Oregon rock shales down there. They're right underneath the White Rim Sandstone. And these were laid down in the depositional environment where it would be marine lowland, braided streams, tidal flats, and they're very easily weatherable. They weather away very easily. However, the White Rim Sandstone, which is this layer right here when you're looking down into the canyons, that very striking white rock that you see at the bottom, they have this really cool relationship where the White Rim Sandstone is relatively hard. It's wind-blown sands, kind of along the coast, and they tend to be very well sorted and very hard to break down. So they act as almost this helmet, this protection to the Oregon rock shale that's easily weathered below it. So you get jointing that can happen. That's where these little cracks form right here, water washes through, and what actually ends up happening a lot of the time is this Oregon rock shale weathers away before the white rim weathers away. So you end up with just these huge chunks of white rim sandstone falling into the canyons, and when you look down you can see these big boulders of it. So then that brings us to the white rim sandstone. The white rim sandstone is very famous out here. It's really famous in Island in the Sky. It houses our white rim road that people come out and do recreation on all the time out in Canyonlands. But one of the interesting things about it, what a lot of people don't know, is it's actually very localized to Island in the Sky. This was this kind of windblown, let me flip it back, windblown coastal area with this white sandy beach. But it was, again, very localized. It was maybe like a little hidden beach. And when I say very localized, I mean it was only to the Island in the Sky district. When you go over to Dead Horse State Park, right next to it, you really don't even see it there. So this is kind of a complicated map. But right up here is where that white rim sandstone is. Here is the rest of Canyonlands. So it's really just to this area right up here. And because of that, and because of the hard nature it has to it, it acts as this strong foundation for everything else to sit on it. Not only does it protect the rocks below it, it also in a sense protects the rocks above it, because things don't really, water doesn't cut through here. It can't be undercut as easily. It doesn't go away as fast, and you end up with the Island in the Sky district, the big mesa top area that we see in Canyonlands today. And that's why we have it up here and really nowhere else in Canyonlands. And so that's kind of a really cool way that geology plays off itself. Then we're going to move into the Moab Formation. This is kind of one of my favorite layers. I think it often gets passed over because it is just kind of this muddy brown rock. It's kind of, it's not flashy, I guess, in a sense, as some of the other ones, like the white rim sandstone has this very striking color, the chinley, it's uranium. This is just kind of a bunch of mud. But with this, there's a lot of really cool, interesting geology in it when it comes to sedimentary structures. And sedimentary structures are not really a type of fossil. They are evidence of how the environment used to look like. So here's an example right here. This is a ripple rock. I carry this around with me all the time. The rangers that are in the room know this. I like to carry that rock around because I think it's a really cool way to talk about one of the basic rules that I mentioned at the very beginning of our lecture, and that's uniformitarianism. These sedimentary structures look exactly, and I'll actually flash over here. These sedimentary structures look exactly like something we'd see today. I can promise you anyone in this room looking at that for a little bit could probably come up with an idea of, yeah, that kind of looks like ripples. That kind of looks like something we'd see at the bottom of like a river or a lake or something like that. And you'd be able to figure that out. And I think that's a super cool way that people can get into geology. People can start to understand what the environment looked like before them, even if they don't think they can necessarily. This is, again, a modern day example of ripple marks, and here is an example, I believe, what did I have down? Yeah, 245, 208 million years ago. Same with this rock right here. You could look at it and see like, oh yeah, those are some ripple rocks there. I know it's kind of hard in the dark. But these are ripples that were formed over 200 million years ago. And the next, we're going to move into kind of the very flashy layer, kind of the younger brother, if you will, of the Moab that really likes to get all the attention, and that is the Chinley Formation. The Chinley Formation, very similar to the Morrison Formation, some of y'all might have seen over in Arches. It has a very striking greenish purple. It has all these different colors to it. It's divided into two different members, the Chinook and the Mossback members. These are just a little bit different due to the depositional environments, but they're all kind of grouped together. These were put down during when this area looked a lot different than what we see now. That ocean has started to recede a little bit that I was been talking about. Those mud flats are gone. and we've moved into a swamp-like environment. This looks like modern-day Louisiana almost. Very organic, lots of trees and life. We find tons and tons of fossils through this. Petrified wood is all over the place. I have two pieces right here, and I can pass that around just if y'all want to check that out. That's one of the cross sections of it, and there is.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We find this all over the place, and those are from the Chinle Formation. And with this too, it has a lot of history tied to the history of Moab, and that has to do with the uranium. Now, most of us have probably heard about the uranium that was associated with Moab back in the 1950s, and that came primarily from either the MOSFAC member or into the Morrison a little bit more. And really that has to do with these bensonites and volcanic ashes. And so here's kind of what uranium looks like. A lot of people ask, what does the uranium look like? People are like frightened by it a little bit. You hear uranium and you have a lot of negative thoughts come to mind, like, oh my goodness, uranium, atomic bombs. I'm going to, turn into the Hulk if I get near one piece of it. All these different thoughts, because yeah, we've had a long history with uranium and atomic weapons. And so just to kind of give you some information on it, uranium is a chemical element. It's found naturally in nature and is primarily known for being weakly radioactive. It's used in nuclear weapons. And we don't really understand fully how the uranium formed here on the Colorado Plateau. We have some different ideas that have to do with the petrified wood. We think that probably the volcanic ash that was being settled here, because that uranium was coming from volcanic ash and settling into these very swampy environments. Actually, as it settled into the water, at the bottoms of these swampy lakes were very, very anaerobic environments, so low oxygen areas. And we think that the chemistry and the petrification of that wood chemically played with the uranium and actually was able to draw out some of that uranium, having to do with some of the charges. We have a rough understanding on it. That's kind of our best idea. But there are some other ideas, and some of it, again, we don't fully understand. But that's kind of what a lot of the uranium would look like out here. Carnotite uranium is kind of this yellow color, and then caused the big uranium mining boom. So this was back in the 1950s. If we think about what was going on in the 1950s, can anybody tell me, why do you think we'd be looking for uranium in the 1950s? Anyone have any ideas?
Cold War.
Exactly, the Cold War. Cold War really pushed the government to say, like, hey, we need a in-house source of uranium. We were getting a lot of it from out of the country, and we said, okay, with this kind of coming up, we don't want to be cut off somehow and not have uranium. We need for folks to go out and look for it. So they were really incentivizing people to do this. This is downtown Moab. Back in the 1950s, here's a uranium truck. There's also tons and tons of other kind of small little tidbits of this part of our history that we can see throughout Moab all over the place. A lot of the time, these mines were not big setups. They weren't like these huge mines that we see today where it's multi-man operations, tons and tons of people working on this. These were like small little things that you and a couple of your buddies were like, hey, let's go look for uranium. So with that said, don't go into these mines if you find them. I'm sure, me included, you get a little curious about it. But they didn't have OSHA sitting around saying, hey, that's not safe. These were just, you kind of do what you want. And so there's some horror stories that are associated with these mines. Just don't go into them if you can avoid it. But a lot of these mines were trying to access, and roads were trying to access into this Chinle Formation. That's where we see a lot of, I talked about the White Rim Road, I'm talking about the White Rim Sandstone. That's where a lot of these roads came from. And then the big one that we hear about a lot of the time out here is the Mi-Vida mine, and that was discovered by Charlie Steen. And while this wasn't inside Canyonlands National Park, it was in the Chinle Formation. And this is the Mi-Vida mine. You can still go and see bits and pieces of it. It's kind of to the south of the La Salles, near the La Salle. And Charlie Steen, if you don't know much about him, he was this geologist, petroleum engineer from Texas, and he got blacklisted. I can't remember. I think he was like, he was just too difficult to work with, and people were like, nah, I don't really want to work with that guy. So he came out here in hopes of finding uranium, and he had this idea that you could drill for uranium. And I was kind of talking about people were looking for uranium in these kind of small setups. They would usually look for stuff like petrified wood due to how it's formed. So drilling for uranium was kind of odd. A lot of people were like, that doesn't really work like that. And for a long time that was proven correct. He was drilling, he wasn't making a lot of money off of it. His family was moved out here with him. His wife was a fantastic sport about it. She brought her out here. I can't imagine, they had like kids with them and just like, hey, let's go move out to Moab in the 1950s so I can go dig holes in the ground. I mean, even now that doesn't sound great. It seems hot. So he started drilling, and finally he ends up hitting this very, very radioactive layer of what we call pitchblende. And pitchblende is a little bit different than the typical carnotite that I was talking about earlier. Carnotite is a little bit weaker radioactive-wise. And with that, that pitchblende was a lot more high grade. The government was willing to pay more for that, and it was a very, very large layer. So he became extremely wealthy very, very fast, and ended up really contributing a lot to the Moab community. And if y'all have ever been to Sunset Grill, that's his old house, fun fact. So if you ever go in there and see all the stuff that's related to him. So again, that was that Mi Vida mine. And from there we move up to the Wingate Sandstones, and these are the striking cliffs we see at Canyonlands. So when you look out on Canyonlands, or you look and you see those huge 400-foot drops and you tell your kid, get away from that, these are the Wingate Cliffs. And these were windblown sand dunes deposited in the Jurassic. And they were windblown, so they were very well sorted, and they became very, very hard to break apart, as opposed to something like, let's say, the Moab Canyonlands, which was this mudstone. So it was very resistant to weathering and erosion. So when it does weather and erode, it breaks off in these huge chunks and gives it this very vertical look to it. Canyonlands Sandstone is this little sandstone, this little intermittent period where this braided streams and kind of monsoon came through. You end up getting this formation a lot in the Canyonlands. This is called the tectonics. And this was just like a small intermittent period. We also do find a lot of dinosaur tracks in here though, because it was in these braided stream beds, but it's kind of this brown ledge forming sandstone. It's kind of thin. It's what you walk around a lot out at Canyonlands. If you all do the Grand Viewpoint hike, you're primarily walking on this stuff. But then we move up to the Navajo Sandstone. The Navajo Sandstone is one of the largest examples of windblown sandstones in the rock record. It's incredible. It's the youngest layer in Canyonlands that we see. It is actually one of the oldest layers in arches because of faulting that was going on there. And it's very famously known for this cross-bedding. And this cross-bedding is this pattern that you see in the rocks where, this isn't a great example, I have another slide on the next slide will show it better. But these layers where they're kind of crossing, and then suddenly you see this hard line cut across here. And then it flips and it starts going the other way. And then there's a hard line and then it flips and goes the other way. Canyonlands is famous for that. Navajo Sandstone is famous for that. I think Aztec Butte was in my textbook for cross-bedding in college. This is a great example to see it. And in Canyonlands, it's really not a big layer. Once you move more west of us, you start, if y'all have ever been to Zion National Park, I know some of us have, you see a lot more of the Navajo Sandstone. It can be much, much more thick. It can be thousands of feet thick there as opposed to maybe a few hundred that we have here at Canyonlands. In this cross-bedding, here's an example of it, where you have these layers and then it hard cut off and then it can flip back and forth. And what's happening is this wind is blowing all these little sand grains up, and then they go over this hill and then they fall in these very nice kind of parallel rows to each other, perpendicular to the area it came up. So this will happen, and then maybe it stops and the wind changes, or some sort of erosion cuts off and causes a tiny little unconformity there. and you get this crisscross effect. And then as water cuts through this, it can give it beautiful patterns and shapes to it. So with all of that, we get a bunch of rocks, but now what? That doesn't explain one bit about why we have canyons and canyonlands. It's called Canyonlands. And that story begins with Uplift and the Colorado Plateau. So we talk a lot about the Colorado Plateau in this area. No matter where you go, you really can't escape it. If you're going to be in Utah, Grand Canyon, Colorado, Arizona, wherever you're going to be, you will see it up here. It's a huge area. What was happening is uplift up here around 50 million years ago during what we call the Laramide Orogeny, which is the same mountain building process. Orogeny is just a fancy way for mountain building. Same process that created the Rocky Mountains, and that was due to a shallow subduction of really the Farallon plate underneath the North American plate. And what normally happens when we have plate subduction is we have our North American plate here, and then we would have some oceanic plate here, and it dips and it goes down at about 45 degrees, and then it finally hits a point where it melts and it bubbles up. The Andes Mountains down in South America are a great example of this. They're a prime example of a little subduction zone. However, we like to make things a little bit difficult here. And it ended up doing this weird thing where it flattened out after a little bit and started grinding across the bottom of our North American plate. Now this example right here is just one example of how we think the Colorado Plateau formed fully. There's one idea that it started to hit a point that it melted and kind of bubbled up and popped up the Colorado Plateau. There's ideas that friction between the two plates actually kind of caused this big chunk to pop up and form the Colorado Plateau and push up this area that we're standing on now. Because again, as I've been talking through all these layers, a lot of them I was mentioning like oceanic deposits or tidal flats or even swamps, which we normally find around sea level. And what elevation are we at right now? Anyone know? 4,000 feet. Yeah, that's a little bit higher than sea level, and that was due to this uplift that was going on. With uplift, there comes erosion. And one of the common questions we get too with this weathering and erosion is why do we see different canyons form? Why does the Grand Canyon look deeper than Canyonlands National Park? It's the same river that's carving it. Why does it look different? And that has to do with the different types of rocks that we have out here. So as this river is cutting down into our rocks, we can have a hard layer that maybe resists it, and then a soft layer down at the bottom that'll form things like slot canyons. We have, if it's just kind of soft layers all together, it will slowly, gradually sink down to the bottom and form like a V-shaped valley. Or we can kind of have this stair-step look too, that we see a lot in Canyonlands, where you get a hard layer like the Wingate, and then a soft layer like maybe like the Chinle and the Moab, and then you hit the white rim, and then it flattens out again, and then it steps back down. We see this, and that's really water. A lot of the time we don't think about it, but water wants to go out before it goes down. It wants to go horizontally. So if it can't go horizontally, maybe the rocks are too hard, it'll just go down. That's where the most friction is. Deepest, fastest flowing part of the river is going to be at the center. So it cuts down there if it can't go out. Some other factors at play that cause canyonlands are rain, freeze-thaw, and just gravity. You can imagine if one of those rocks is coming down, it's going to take a lot down with it. And then there's different types of canyons. I always like to show these just to kind of show you visibly what this process looks like. Here's Canyonlands National Park, these huge, yes, they are very, very deep canyons, but very wide canyons. You can't really even see where this side starts over here and connects over to the other side. So you get these very wide canyons due to some of the softer rocks that we have. Then we move into the Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon, you get a mix of softer rocks, but once you get down a little bit lower, you move into schist, which typically is a lot harder than the sandstones. And so it cuts down instead of going out, so you get very deep canyons here. You get these huge, mile-deep canyons as opposed to wide canyons. And then here's a very good example of what happens if you get just schist all the way through. This is Black Canyon Gunnison, and this is just it moving straight down through the rock. And so you get this very narrow canyon that's just moving down. So you can definitely see that difference as you flip through them all. And then after that kind of covers everything as far as Canyonlands go, I like to kind of finish this off with Upheaval Dome and talk about this, because this is a very big geologic example in Canyonlands National Park, and we really don't know much about it, even though it's a very, very big primary thing we'd like to talk about out there. So it's this huge hole in the ground. It's got all this stuff coming up in the center. Looks probably, a lot of y'all probably heard, it's like a meteor crater, salt, whatever it might be. We'll talk about both those theories. We talked about very beginning salt domes. Here is that salt pushing up. We think that maybe there was some sort of pressure that kind of caused it to push up. Again, that kind of toothpaste theory where salt starts to flow up here. And they actually think that Upheaval Dome, kind of the center area where that salt got pushed up, would be the stem of the salt dome. So kind of somewhere like down here as opposed to material up here. And so it pushes it up and drags material up with it and kind of forms this center that we see here. And the other theory, when you look at this, you probably think it, a lot of people do, looks like a meteorite impact crater, and that's totally reasonable. It's this impact crater. And so what they think might have happened was this meteor came down and crashed into the surface, and then when it hit, it caused this kind of big explosion, threw a bunch of material out, pushed down on the center, and caused what we call isostatic rebound, where material comes back up. So you can kind of imagine like if you jumped on a trampoline, you jump down, and then it wants to naturally come up. Now this is obviously rock, not a trampoline, so this happens over a long time. And so the material that we're seeing in the center is material that has rebounded up, because this stuff right here should be about 400 to 500 feet deeper than where it actually is. And what I kind of like to end on with this is talking about what if the theory is both. For a very long time with Upheaval Dome, we have either subscribed to impact crater or salt dome theory, and those are the two. And in geology, that's what we get a lot. We get this it is either this or it is this. It is black or it is white. And I always like to kind of introduce this gray area between the two. Really, you can't, or you take both theories and you kind of put them together and they fit together very nicely. What could have happened was that this meteorite came down, hit this area, and then the salt helped in that isostatic rebound effect and pushed a lot of the material up, and that's what caused that salt to move up in the first place. And in general, not only with Upheaval Dome, but in geology overall, we're trained in a scientific background. We want answers to match up with our textbooks. We want things like Aztec Butte to match up with our cross-bedding. But the reality is that the world doesn't necessarily work like that. Things aren't black or white. And it can be very difficult in geology to find out these answers without maybe stretching and moving into more of these gray areas and looking for stuff. I've talked a lot about things that we don't know here, and maybe those answers lie in those gray areas.